Hi, and welcome back to Critical Thinking, Module 3. And here we're going to carry on with the second part of Argumentation and Critical Thinking. So last week we looked at argumentation and we decided that it was based on civility, friendship, persuasion, and consensus. It isn't about shouting past each other or screaming so loud that they're the person that wins the argument. It's instead these four aspects: civility and friendship and consensus in particular. And if we were to look for a definition, we would say it's two things. It's the ability to convince others to think the way that we do, or do something that we do also, or also to decide for ourselves what we should think or do. So argumentation can also be self-directed. It doesn't have to be necessarily towards another person or another group. But there are a couple of things that we should keep in mind. We don't want to accept claims blindly without testing them. We don't want to leap to conclusions either without looking at the evidence and weighing the evidence and the ideas associated with it. Instead, we should seek patience, a good degree of skepticism. We should use facts as evidence and look at them, test them, and then use them for support. And we can do this actually quite easily by just asking ourselves the following questions. Is the idea or plan supportable? Can I support it through evidence? Is the belief in the idea I'm trying to convey to someone or even to myself defensible? Is the belief in the idea even logical? Not the idea itself, but even the belief in that idea. Is it logical? And can I explain this belief about such facts to other people? So if we can do that, we most likely have a fairly solid argument on our hands. Now, when we are discussing things in our multicultural world in Canada and across North America, we need to also be wary of cultural differences. Be aware of them because we have to remember that others have different belief systems. We may have the same value system, but we have different belief systems. So we need to account for the way in which different people understand words differently. It's not a monolithic understanding around the world of what specific words may mean. So when we are aware of that, we choose our words carefully and we continually seek consensus to make sure that the person we're speaking to, in that case, understands what we're saying. And if it's to ourselves, clearly that may not be an issue. But we need to make sure that what we're saying is sound. It's sound because it can be supported by facts and that belief can be tested logically. Now, what is not an argument, by the same token, is negotiation, right? The idea of the fact that you will literally let anything slide so long as you can end the argument. Well, that's negotiating in bad faith because you simply want the argument to be over. So you're willing to concede anything just to have it end. Depending on who you're arguing with, that may be a way out, and then you can go back to it later. Propaganda, that's not a form of argumentation. You're worrying less about reasons and facts, and instead you're trying to propagate some kind of position, some kind of ideology that is informing those facts or that understanding of those facts in such a way that you're basically providing them with propaganda. It's not based on scientific evidence. And finally, coercion. Coercion is simply browbeating someone, and there's an uneven power dynamics between the speaker and the listener. Do this or else. That's not an argument. That's a command, right? That's a dictate, and that's not an argument. So ultimately, what we want to do is we want to listen to the other side. We want to make sure that that other side is heard and is understood. Because if you don't do that, then we are being simply one-sided in our argumentation, and we're not conceding or even being aware of what that other person is, the position that they're coming from. So when we sit down and try to write a paper, we're trying to come up with a kind of a sound argument. There's a variety of different ways that we can do this. Some people just start writing. They just start writing, and whether you want to call it verbal diarrhea or whatever, they just start writing and they have a draft that they want to just get ideas on paper. So they simply want to get those ideas so they can look at them later on and look at them perhaps a little bit more objectively. Depending on your style, whether you think a lot and then you write, or it's a combination of both, or you simply just start your draft right away and worry about its shape and organization and structure and logic later on. There's no good or bad way. It's the way in which you write the best. In my particular case, I tend to think about something for a long, long time, and I just almost let it, well, I don't want to say let it fester, but I let it sort of ruminate, we'll call it that. And then when it comes time to writing, even though I'm still open to new ideas, I have a fairly good idea of the direction that I wish to go in. So experienced writers know that they have to think and plan before they draft. I'm not calling myself an experienced writer. I just simply have the time that I've allocated to writing since the age of 15. So a lot of years, good 40, 45 years I've been writing. And it depends on the project. Slightly different strategies. A shorter paper clearly can be looked at differently than a book length project or something that I know will need to be at least 100 pages. It really depends. But it's the habits that we have to write in the most effective way. And so if you can organize your critical thinking and your argumentation in the following categories, you're going to be okay. And the first is thinking and talking. So thinking about it, talking to people, talking to friends and relatives and people that you trust that will listen to you non-judgmentally and will simply ask the right questions. That is not an ideal person. You can begin reading and researching. You can start formulating early ideas. And from there, after you're thinking and talking and reading and researching, you can start to prepare, right? You start to prepare and plan. You can write out a kind of a bare bones structure of what this thing is going to be like. You know, what are the high points that I wish to touch on in my paper? Which do I think is more important? Should I put those at the beginning or at the end of my paper? So a whole range of things really will matter in terms of the degree of preparedness you have put in, the degree to which you want to plan this thing. Do you want it planned right down to the last word, or do you want to still keep it open so that you're researching what you're researching with an open mind? That ideally is the best way to go about it. You start writing, so you're drafting, you're revising, and you keep shaping and reshaping this thing into something that is really solid. And there's nothing wrong with working collaboratively as well, because if you're thinking and talking, you're already kind of doing that. You're not sort of presenting a finished product to someone, but you're certainly presenting the idea to someone for the two of you to kind of talk about. And so that interaction between that other person that is listening to you without judging, that's the best way that you can begin really formulating your idea in a concise and clear way. So if, as you can imagine, you're thinking about things well before you start writing them, or you should. I really don't recommend writing something that's due the night before, because they're always a mess. And you're going to stress over it. It's going to look like a first draft very clearly, because it's incoherent. It seems to flow one way or the other. It really has no structure to speak of. So if you can give yourself the time, you can at least allow yourself to think about it and not panic about it. I've got to get 2 pages done. So if you can think about it, you'll find that your unconscious mind continues working on it even when you're not really thinking about it. Now, you don't want to wake up at 3 a.m. worried about it, but that's when your unconscious does its best work. It's not distracted. So consider that a blessing. But if you come up with something really good, I recommend writing it down. If your memory is really good, don't worry about it. But if it's something like, oh my God, I never thought of that, write it down, because it'll disappear. So when you are thinking about your argument, your paper, you're thinking about it consciously and quite often unconsciously. So that's not a bad thing. Okay, again, experienced writers. I'm not saying professional writers. Professional writers usually are pretty draconian and pretty pragmatic about writing. Often they have to write within a very specifically, a set number of words. So they're constantly shaving down their argument. But let's say an experienced writer, someone that has been writing for a few years, still within academic circles. As a student, you may have been writing essays in high school. You may have written a couple even in public school, it's shorter things, but you're still gaining experience as a writer. And the more you write, then the better you become in this whole process that I've just pointed out, sort of thinking and talking and planning and preparing and all these kinds of things. So as a student writer, you're developing your ideas quite often on your own because Yes, we as people don't like to present things that are half finished. Sometimes we're embarrassed. We're afraid of looking foolish because we haven't formed our ideas completely. And that's why I stress speaking to someone that you trust, because that person is not going to judge you. They're going to listen. And if you have an attentive audience, that is a gift. And you need to treat it wisely and say, here's where I'm at right now. And if that person listens carefully, they will often provide the right answers. And if you haven't explained it properly, those questions will help to generate a better version of what you've just discussed. So there's nothing wrong with it. Start by talking about your ideas to people, whether they're professionals or they're friends or their loved ones, it doesn't matter. But having a chance to talk out loud about an idea is a really good way to test not necessarily the validity of their idea, but how clear it is in your head. Because if you explain something to someone and they really don't have a clue what you're talking about, chances are you've got to go back to the drawing board. So imagine the proverbial elevator pitch, right? The elevator story. And it is kind of a way to kind of get to the point of what it is that you're talking about. If you pick up many books, especially scholastic books, obviously nonfiction, and you turn to the back, often there'll be maybe a one paragraph summary, like a kind of abstract of the book. It's more so a summary because abstracts sort of give you the highlights. The blurb on the back of a book kind of gives you an overview of the totality of the book. And they're still very useful. But let's say you've got an elevator pitch and you've got, let's say 5 floors to go up. What you could do is one of 4 of these things, right? You can say, look, you're going to question the address of the problem that is at hand. I'm going to write about the following, and here's why. Why is it important, right? I've chosen this problem because of the following. Best guess at an answer. If you have one, here is where I think the solution is. And finally, where do you expect to find the evidence? I think the best evidence is in this particular text, or I've got to go out and interview people. All these things have to have a lot to do with articulating the problem at hand, why you've chosen that problem, why is it important to you, what do you plan on doing with it, how are you going to find a solution. And so these things are important in the sense that they help you to shape and formulate that which you want to write about. So that elevator pitch is really important because you want to be able to get to the heart of the matter. Why am I writing this? Why is this important? What good will this have, to the betterment of mankind, we'll say. Maybe it isn't that important, but it is something you want to pursue. And there's nothing wrong with that. There are hundreds of thousands of PhD dissertations on the most minute things. And typically when you get to graduate school, when you are writing papers that are, most papers are 15 or 20 pages, but let's say you're writing an actual dissertation. Some of those, on the average, are about 300 to 400 pages. And what happens is your knowledge may be an inch wide, but it's a mile deep. So you pick one small little thing and you dig down to the very bottom. So you have to be able to articulate as clearly as possible that specific problem and why it's important. How does it fit in with the rest of that person's, sort of worldview? Why have you chosen this particular, small aspect of their work? What's the importance in their work and in yours and your understanding of it? So as you are doing this, the best thing to do is to imagine a reader. Like if you can't do the elevator pitch, then imagine your reader is someone that is at the very least interested in what you're saying. So that imagined or that real reader, again, can be a friend, a parent, a loved one. It doesn't matter who it is, but they're going to interrupt you with those hard questions, possible objections. They may retort right with one of their own views, but really at the end of the day, they're kind of asking, well, why should I read this book? Why should I read this essay? Why should I care? And that becomes something that you have to defend. Why is writing this worthwhile? Obviously, the short answer is, well, I need to get a mark. I've got to hand something in. And that's true. But let's say you're in a position like I was about a year ago when I ended up getting an idea that I wished to follow. And it was writing about the Situationists. I mentioned this to you before. And I really had no one to sort of bounce ideas off of until I had a chance to at least formulate in my own mind what I wanted to do. And from there, it became a little bit clear. Okay, I'm going to provide a historical overview on these people. Okay, why is that important? Well, because typically when we read about these individuals, if we ever find anything about them, it's assuming an awful lot on behalf of the reader that they know who they are, they know their history, they know their position in the history of thought, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write a book that provides that for people. So, okay, why should I care? This is why. If you ever encounter these people, and you will have read my book first, there isn't anything you're going to find out about these people that you don't at least have some degree of knowledge beforehand. Go, oh yeah, okay, I see what this person's saying, because this relates to their influences from these people or those people or that group of thinkers. So all that kind of stuff. Imagine the reader at the very least, right? At the very least, is interested in what you have to say. So you rarely pick up a book that you're not interested in. It shouldn't happen. It may happen in high school when you read books that you just really otherwise would never pick up, but this isn't the same thing. Typically, when someone picks up an article to read or an essay or a book, it's because they have an interest in it. So you're not having to fight that with people. You at least have them on your side in that degree. So think of the reader, think of that person as being someone like yourself. They have an interest in that field. So how do you want to do it? Do you want to keep an open mind as you're writing this thing and sort of discover along the way things that you may not have known? Because often, in my case, that's what I've done. I always keep an open mind. I constantly ask myself questions. Why is this? Why should I say this? Why am I making this statement? And if you can do that, you're basically, you have a kind of individual that is looking over your shoulder and always kind of pointing things out. Well, how come you said this? And why are you moving from this to that? If you can do that, and you can imagine someone who's at least to some degree friendly and has some degree of intelligence and is open-minded, you're going to be writing for that person. So you are sometimes asking the questions right in the text. Why should we do this? And there's nothing wrong with that, because at the very least, it's an indicator to the reader that you are thinking about what you're writing. I know it sounds weird, but there's nothing wrong with reading something and the question that is popping up or just about to pop in your mind, there you see it formulated right in front of you on the page. Okay, what's happening? You're right on track. You are following the argument. You're on track and asking the same questions that the writer that spent a lot of months, if not years, on that text is asking themselves the same question. That's pretty cool, because that means you are paying attention and you are absorbing that argument. And you're going, oh, okay, why are we switching gears and going here? And there you go. The writer says the same thing or asks the same question. So as you're working through the material, there's nothing wrong with doing that. Now, also, as you are reading something and you're preparing for research, the same sort of thing can be going on. And as you're reading through, if you do like me, I'm constantly marking up books. I'm underlining them, highlighting them. I've got comments on the pages. I literally do this all the time. And that way I can go back and I can refresh my mind as to why this passage was important. The first time I read it, there was something about it that was interesting and important. So I underlined it. I may have put one of these little things that I go like this. So my eye, like visually, oh, this is important. Or I put a little note on the side, see also this. Because as I'm reading, I'm also thinking of other books that I can sort of tie these two ideas together. So what's happening is there's a kind of dialogue going on between your mind, the book that you are in the process of writing, or the essay you're in the process of writing, which is kind of imagined in your mind. Okay, this is sort of what it's going to look like. And as you're reading through and you're preparing, again, you haven't written anything. You're just on this kind of imaginary level. And you're saying, okay, this is what I want to write about. So as I'm looking for those ideas in other people's work, when I see it, I want to emphasize it and underline it. And the more I do that, the more this thing starts to shape itself, almost like a kind of jigsaw puzzle. And eventually all those pieces will fall into place. So as you're doing this, you want to ask yourself the following questions. Right? What problems are you trying to solve? What is the solution to the problem? Do you want your reader to think about something or to do something? What are the reasons that support the particular claim that you're making? What evidence also are you going to use to support the reasons? Everything needs to support everything else. So it's balanced and it's structured. And when we say that something is structured logically, that's how you do it. So reading and researching for articles, if the paper warrants, or if it's a research paper, for example, then of course you're having to look through various text books. You're looking for articles with abstracts especially. But as you're reading through the material, this is essentially what you're doing. Now, there are strategies in which to do this, to do it very effectively, because if you're in school, you're always pressed for time. Quite often, this is not the only course that you're taking, so you're having to do other things as well. So as you are reading through, there's a couple things that you can do. You can at least find the introduction and read through it. And it's typically the first or second paragraph in the text. It should be. So read through that and see whether it is of some interest to your overall idea, right? What is your main thesis? Always make sure that you've got that clear in your mind before you go any further. And with that thesis in mind, right, you are thinking of it explicitly, then you start reading the introduction and see if it offers anything. So read through it, skip to the end of it, and just say, does this introduction bear any kind of fruit, or does it carry any kind of weight towards my main argument? If it looks reasonably interesting, then carry on. But what I would recommend doing is skip to the conclusion. If it's well written and it's well structured, if you go to the conclusion, then the main points that are raised in the body paragraphs should be reintroduced, or at least summarized in some way. So you've read the introduction, you skip to the conclusion, and you take a look at it and say, yeah, I think this article, remember, some of these could be 15 or 20 pages long. They're quite lengthy. So if you look at the intro and the conclusion, you should have a very good idea of the general tone and the scope and the intent of the article. At that point, if it's still interesting, then you can look through some of the body paragraphs, understand the organization and sequence of topics. Did they go from the most to the least important, or the reverse? Or are they all important? Does it follow logically? Is it built chronologically? All these things matter. And I would just say, I would read the first couple of paragraphs of the article once you've read the introduction and the conclusion to see if it is useful. And if it is, then you hold on to it. If you're reading a book, you can do the same thing with a table of contents. You can look at the opening section, whether it's an introduction, a preface, an overview, chapter 1 even. Look at the beginning of the book. The beginning of the book, if it's well written, should give you the gist of the argument. It should tell you pretty clearly what it's about. So you want to look at the beginnings and the conclusion of the overview. Let's say it's called a preface. Look at the beginning of the preface and at the end, and that should give you a clear idea of what's going on. For example, in the book I just finished, my original preface really, in hindsight, didn't present very clearly the main idea, which was to present this group of thinkers and theorists and artists. It didn't really present them until almost halfway through the preface. So my editor said, you need to place the reason why this book exists in your preface. So I thought, how about right at the very beginning? And so I rewrote the preface. And if you were to just read the first two paragraphs, then I've done that. If you just read that, you're going to say, yeah, this is a really interesting book, because I know about these people. I don't really a whole lot about where they kind of fit in terms of the history of things. That's exactly what this book's about. And so within the first two paragraphs, literally the first page, it's a 300-page book, but the first page tells you exactly what it's about. So if someone were to pick up that book and they focus on the beginning and in the conclusion of the preface, they would have a very good idea of what's going on. My conclusion, again, I do the same thing. I provide kind of an overview of everything that has come up to that point, and then we kind of proceed a little bit further and kind of open up the argument. So whatever you're looking at, whether it's a book or an essay, if it's structured the same way, you should be able to research very effectively and pragmatically. It's a very good way to get the most amount of information, or access to the most amount of information, in the least amount of time. So articles that appear on the net, on the web, should be set up the same way, more or less. Now, what's really good about research papers that are available on the net, and these are often papers that have appeared somewhere else, and they are often peer-reviewed, which means that they are even better quality. Other individuals with an expertise in the same field have read that paper and have critiqued it and have said, you need to clarify this, this, or this. So the writer goes back and makes that paper even better. So first of all, peer-reviewed papers are much better. Secondly, many of them have got what's called an abstract at the beginning. And that abstract provides an overview of the main points of the paper. So if you are really pressed for time, I strongly recommend reading the abstract through and see whether it's something that might be helpful. And now, even if you were to pick up journals, actual physical journals, I don't know if the library at Fanshawe still has them. I know at Western they've got stacks and stacks of that kind of stuff, or at least they used to. But those essays are exactly the same. So if you pick up a journal article, it will have an abstract and an introduction. So you've got an even better chance of finding the exact information that you need. So you've done all this work, and so at this point you've thought about it, you've talked to your friends, people you trust, you're forming and shaping this idea, and now you're going to begin to prepare and plan. So as you are thinking about your argument, and you want to structure it so that it's objective and it's fair and it's disciplined in some way, you start to kind of write and formulate that which you want to talk about. So there are different ways to do it, to prepare and plan, whether you want to write partly, then stop and go back, or keep on writing, or say, no matter what, I want to write 1 page a day. Whatever the structure is, it doesn't matter. The one that works best for you is the one that you want to follow through with. Okay, so you want to start planning your argument by deciding what you want, what you want to do. What's the main idea? Is there a plan for the reader to gain information? Yes, at the very least, you want your reader to learn something. If you're trying to solve a problem, the global warming, there's a big topic, global warming. Okay, here's my solution. Would the reader agree with you? Because that's something that you want to consider. Because if the reader doesn't agree with you because your solutions are so far-fetched and cost prohibitive and all the rest of it, chances are it's just a theory, right? It's just an idea. But what do you want the readers to gain from your text? Do you want them to change their way of thinking, change their behavior? Clearly, if it's about global warming, you want them to do both. But you need to ask yourself, what do you gain if readers agree with your solution or if they disagree? How will you deal with that? Because there are 2 ways to look at problems. Problems can be conceptual or practical. A problem is conceptual if it's something that is you're asking the reader to consider an idea. So it's a concept, right? You want them to consider an idea. In other words, you're looking for them to change their mind. So the conceptual solution that you have for them is something that is going to be a change of mind for the reader. Now, if the problem is more practical, something like global warming, I suppose, if the problem is practical, if you're getting your readers to change their behavior, to support a particular form of action. So it really depends on what you want to do. But each of these, whether it's conceptual or practical, will have a lot to do with how you wish to prepare and plan your particular paper. So if you're not sure, you want to decide as soon as you can as to what kind of a claim that you're going to be making and what you think the reader will think about, about this particular claim. So you have to make it, and then you have to ask yourself, how will my reader, believe in this? How will they embrace this idea? Is it worthy of considering? Is it effective? Is it practical? Is it conceptual? And all these things will become very important as you continue to prepare and plan. Now, I would say for the most part, when you're writing a paper, it is more kind of a conceptual problem. You're asking your instructor or whoever is reading it to consider an idea, right? To consider the the validity of a poem, the validity of a particular statement made by someone. These are still conceptual problems, but they're written down on paper. They're not necessarily asking you to change your behavior, but they're certainly asking you to potentially change your mind. So whatever it is, conceptual or practical, consider building your argument around a question whose answers might be one step towards that goal, right? That conceptual or practical goal. So the book doesn't have to be the be-all and end-all of all problems known to humanity. Far from it. As I said, when you're working in that kind of field, your knowledge may be an inch wide, or the concept might be an inch wide, but it's still a mile deep. So you're going to be digging down into this one possible solution that could be conceptual or it could be practical. So you start thinking, okay, you've talked, you've formulated, you've researched, you've prepared, you've planned, and now the fun part, the writing, which is for most people the worst part. But it's a lot less difficult if you have taken the time to do all the other steps that I've presented to you. So what you're doing is you're drafting and you're revising. Some writers like to basically pump out the whole thing first and then go back and reshape it. I, for whatever reason, like to start each day from where I started, like not where I started the day before, the first line. And I read through it, and I kind of build up steam as I get to where I left off, because I find it more difficult to pick up where I left off than to start at the beginning. Even if I have to read 10 pages, it doesn't matter, because here's what's happening. As I'm reading through the first 10 pages, I'm also revising. I'm correcting, revising, clarifying. It's all good. It's all useful. So what I do is, as I read through from the very first line of chapter, the essay, topic, whatever it is, I'm reading through. So what happens is when I finish that essay, or at least believe I finished it to the best of my abilities, I've already drafted it probably half a dozen times. So depending on how long it took me to write it, each day that I start reading from the beginning, and I keep reading through up to the point I left off, and I carry on. And sometimes that whole day might be spent just drafting. I might go back and rewrite, and suddenly the idea that I thought belonged on page 12, I think, okay, you know what makes more sense on page 6? Okay, so I work that material in. So as I'm moving towards my goal of I need 20 pages, suddenly we're at 12, and I've only read through the first, half dozen pages. I've written enough new material that I've pushed now the 12 to 14, 15 pages. So that's my way of working. I'm pretty comfortable in it because I've been doing this a lot, but each of you will work differently. Some, like I say, some people like to just write the whole thing out in one shot, and they're very happy with it. So regardless of the way in which you work, the one that fits you best is the one you want to stay with. So as you're drafting, you are thinking about a variety of solutions, if that seems to be the nature of the paper. And you are thinking about various hypotheses. This is something I wish to present. This is something I would like to also test. And so when you're presenting a hypothesis, it could be a tentative solution. And it's tentative because now you've got to look for facts that will support that hypothesis and turn it into a clear idea. So hypothesis is something that is testable. And so you have to be able to test it for it to go beyond that state. So when you are doing that, if you are writing in a kind of tentative form, there's nothing wrong with that, because you are now testing the validity of your thesis, testing the validity of your argument, and saying, okay, here's what I think the solution is to the following problem. Now I've done my research. I've got to find evidence, scientific or otherwise, but scientific evidence and facts that support this idea, which right now is only a hypothesis, but I want it to become more. I want it to be a clear, supportable idea that is logical, that is clearly presented. And all of a sudden, what was just sort of a tentative notion becomes solid. It becomes verifiable. It becomes testable. And all these things matter in how solid your original idea was as it moved from that to hypothesis, from thesis to hypothesis to finally clear idea. Now, as I mentioned, as you're drafting, some people draft slowly, carefully, others very quickly. Again, it depends. For me, if using myself as an example, I'll do a lot of thinking before I sit down and write. But when I'm ready to write, I'm not saying it's easier, but it is clear in my mind what it is I'm trying to do, because I have some notion in mind, and I rarely use sort of a structured outline. I just kind of write. I like to write intuitively. I like to sort of let ideas take me to different places. Quite often I discover things that I literally did not know when I started. And that to me is a bit more of an enjoyable experience, because you're kind of half writer, half bloodhound, because you find something in a footnote, so you kind of dig a little bit further. And the joy of the internet being this revolutionary tool that we have, it doesn't take long for any one of us to find more information. And if you have the ability to read more than one language, then you have even more stuff at your disposal. So even if you could just read English, it doesn't matter. But if you are a careful drafter, you want to write each sentence out carefully. It might take a little bit more time, but you know that as you move forward, it's still pretty solid. So whichever style works for you, whether you're a careful drafter or a quick drafter, whatever you're doing, whatever works best for you will be the style or the structure that you work within. So for me, I think I'm kind of in the middle. I don't really know. I'm definitely not a quick drafter, because I still kind of plod along and I try to work out my ideas, and very critical, and I keep asking myself questions. So I'd like to say that I'm bit leaning more towards a quick drafter, because I want to get those things down on paper, but I know certain things need to be fleshed out. I'm not a careful drafter in the sense that I stop and every sentence has to be absolutely shaped beautifully before I go on to the next. I don't think I can do that 100%. So I'm kind of in the middle. So regardless, whichever works for you. So the final step, if you've done the thinking, you've done the talking, you've done the researching, you've done the planning, you've done the drafting, and now you're doing the revising. This is probably, out of all the text or the tasks, I should say, probably the easiest, because the work's been done and you have done all the formulating and you've proven your hypothesis. It's now a clear idea. But then you've got to go back and make sure that you've actually said what you want to say. So some people that are quick drafters spend obviously more time revising. Those that are careful drafters spend less time revising. So it really depends. If you write quickly, you got to revise more. If you write slowly, you got to revise less. It's pretty straightforward. The problem with revising, though, is when you revise your own work. And here's what happens is often you think there's a word that is there that you remember writing the sentence, and you read through it maybe a little too quickly, and you forget that there are words that are missing because you don't see them. So if you have someone else that can read your work, then again, that is an absolute joy, because you can sit back and just take a deep breath, let that other person read through it, and they will see the missing words, trust me. But you can also do that if you give yourself some time and say, okay, I'm going to write a couple of pages. Let's say it's a 10-page assignment and you've got 2 weeks to do it. So let's say you write 3 or 4, maybe 5 pages if you're really lucky. You've had a good week of good ideas. Leave it for a couple of days, and then go back and then read slowly through it, because even just the time of a few days will allow your mind to sort of refresh itself, and you start reading through it, and you start catching those little mistakes, or catching sort of a statement that is a bit clunky. So you can go back and you can revise it and make it better. But like I say, the hardest thing to do is to revise your own work without another pair of eyes looking at it, or having to do it all at once. Because if you do that, you're going to often read into your writing something that you want the readers to get out of it. And it may not be there. It may not be valid. So we want to be very careful. So any kind of distance you can give yourself from the draft. Again, this is why I stress not writing something the night before, because you don't have that time. You literally don't. You're writing under pressure, and you are probably not going to do a very good job. If you have that time, you can set aside that draft for even one day. Even if you can afford one day, and go back to it, reread it, and you're going to catch a lot of those mistakes. So the best strategy is to revise your draft in a way that deliberately sidesteps, the sort of that understanding you have. Be your own worst critic. Keep questioning yourself and say, why? Why this here? Could this fit somewhere else? So this is where, once you've got the whole thing down and you kind of block it all out, you may be able to take one section that belongs in a completely different page and bring it in and have these two ideas sit next to each other, and they kind of complete one another. And the end result is that you look at something and you look at it sort of more of a totality, right? You look at it completely before you move on to the next thing. So once the draft is done and you have the time to do these kinds of things, the end result obviously is a much better paper. So nothing wrong with that. Now, the last thing is working collaboratively. You can maybe do that, but if you collaborate with people, again, you want to trust one another. You want to enlist that other person to read your work. And again, if they do it without judgment, that is the best way to do it. But yeah, we fear being sort of laughed at or questioned, like, it's kind of clunky. I don't really get what you're trying to say. It's going to help your paper. It's called constructive criticism. And having your friend hand it back to you to say, well, it's not very good. Well, why? What's wrong with it? You want something a little bit more than it's not very good. If your friend is allowed to butter up and mark up your paper, allow them to do that, because then you can go back and use that very useful feedback to revise your paper in very specific ways. And the end result is it's a very solid paper. So if you have a chance to work collaboratively with someone, you can then be able to see your own work more objectively, because others are reading it certainly on your behalf, but that work can be looked at more objectively because now people can look at it and question it before it kind of gets sent out to the professor or instructor or gets sent off to a publisher. All of that is good. And what ends up happening is when you start thinking about that ideal reader, that if you can work collaboratively, imagine that person there. So if you can also learn how to anticipate some of the questions and objections that person may have. And you formulate those to yourself and answer them before they even see it for the first time. So imagine that reader there. So those questions and objections are dealt with firsthand. You can ask questions to another writer whose paper you are reading. And again, you are speaking to them in a civil tone. You're amicable, you're friends, you trust one another. And also you need to listen to their answers. Don't block that off, because constructive criticism is exactly that, constructive. It is very, very useful. So if you can interact critically with one another, you're going to end up becoming a more credible writer because you can handle criticism. When you can't, you need to ask yourself why that is. Are you embarrassed by what you've written? Then you need to maybe revise it more. Are you just not prone to criticism at all? At one point, you've got to sort of toughen up your perspective and say, look, whatever these people say will only make my work better. And you have to look at it that way. And it is a positive, good thing. So you're also going to learn how to critique others too, because remember, they are reading your paper. You're also reading their paper. And it doesn't need to be the same person. It could be a group of people, and this person will read that other person's paper and vice versa. So you get to learn how to provide constructive criticism to another person in an objective, credible, amiable sort of way. And you are providing, constructive ideas, but also, and you do that to other people, but also be willing to accept it for your own work. So it does really help. So the quick summary here, the last two slides, to define an argument. It's not belligerence and abrasiveness. No, it's the desire for your idea to be presented to an audience and for them to consider it. And if it's conceptual, you want them to think differently, or if it's practical, to behave differently. And that's really it. So two or more people want to solve a problem they don't agree on in the solution. So you need to work on that, exchanging reasons and evidence that they think supports their particular solutions and their responses to one another's questions, objectives, and alternatives. All that is argumentation. So if you are honest people and you're civil people and you can be persuasive, you can argue about just about anything. But remember that that other party needs to be, just as objective as you are. It can't simply say, I refuse to entertain that. Then you're no longer arguing. That person has basically blocked you completely, and no argument is going to succeed that way. So if you're writing an argument, you want to be able to pose to yourself the reasons why that problem comes up in the first place. Why are you writing about it? What do you want to achieve? What do you want your readers to understand? Do you want them to change their minds, change their behavior? Why is that understanding important? That's important in and of itself. It becomes the reason to write in the first place. Once you understand your problem, you can try a few solutions. Pick the one that it works best for you, that seems the most promising. List the reasons that would encourage readers to agree with you. Here's my hypothesis. It is a thesis, but right now it's only in the form of a hypothesis to be tested. And if that's the case, that's where you start working. And then once you actually get through the talking, the researching, the planning and preparing, then build up your draft in the best way that you see that is good for you. Quick and messy, slow and careful, a mixture of the two, it doesn't matter. Just leave yourself some time to be able to go back and revise no matter what, because revision really is where that argument, which is probably not bad, can become even better. And just learn to accept criticism. I had an article, the very first large article I published in 1987 in Cinema Canada, and it's still in there, on immigrants in the NFB. You can look it up, you can Google it too. So Edward Matthews, Immigrants in the NFB. And I worked really hard on that paper, and I was really proud of that paper. And I worked, for 2 months, and it was published. And one of the guys that worked sort of as an adjunct editor looked at it and said, yeah, it wasn't bad. Could have used another rewrite. Did I punch him in the head? No. I said, okay, that's all I could say. And there it is. So it does happen. And we worked really hard, and we work a little bit harder the next time. And we just get, we get better at it. So it does happen. Even someone, if I call myself an experienced writer, it does happen. You think you've done really well, and somebody comes along and says, yeah, it's okay. Could have used another draft. Sure. All right. Thank you, expert. But you got to take it. It wasn't constructive. He didn't tell me in any way, shape, or form how it could have been made better. But that's just what that person said. It is what it is. So that's a quick summary of the second half of argumentation and persuasion. We're going to meet again on Thursday. I'm in the process of still reading through your material. I will have all the marks done when we meet on Thursday at noon. So rest assured that everything you've handed in by that point will have been marked. I've got probably about half of them done already. I've got a few other things that are coming in at the same time. So in the meantime, take care, and we will see each other in a couple of days. Bye-bye.